Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. This is a fantasy movie review and I'll be having a look at Sword of the Valiant. Also known as Sword of the Valiant, The Legends of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So this is actually based on a 14th century poem which actually takes place during the reign of King Arthur. Now it's been adapted for the screen a couple of times before, but this one we're going to be looking at is the 1984 version starring Miles O'Keeffe and Sean Connery. So the story takes place, as I mentioned, in King Arthur's court, and we're in a kind of peacetime during this period of King Arthur's reign, and he's kind of getting a little bit disgruntled that his knights are basically kind of getting lazy and kind of used to sort of the time of peace. And it just so happens that this particular night, in comes the Green Knight, played by Sean Connery, issuing a challenge to all the knights for them to chop off his head. However, once they chop off his head, the deal is that if he's able, the Green Knight is then able to chop the offending knight's head off himself. So no one wants any part of it. It's the only person who volunteers is a squire, or Gawain at this point, played by Miles O'Keeffe. Now, because he's only a squire, he's quickly knighted by the king and thus takes the challenge. And sure enough, he cuts off Sean Connery's head. However, Sean Connery's the Green Knight is kind of a magical type creature, and who, though his head is cut off, he's able to reattach it. But he gives Gawain basically a year to live because he's so young, and basically says in a year's time, we'll meet again, and I'm going to chop your head off. That's basically agreed. But Gawain basically sort of pleads with him to say, is there anything else that he can do? So the Green Knight gives him a riddle with 4 lines in it that he must complete to have any sort of chance of not having his head cut off. So pretty much the rest of this movie is Gawain going on a quest to ultimately try and discover what the riddles mean so he can have an answer in a year's time. So after he's faced the Green Knight, basically Sir Gawain must go on a quest to ultimately discover the answers to the riddle that the Green Knight has given him. And this basically leads him to pretty much some other sort of unrelated to a degree stories. And then ultimately at the end of the movie, we have his final confrontation with the Green Knight. Now along the film, Sir Gawain meets a few allies, and he also meets the love of his life, this Princess Lynette, in this kind of mysterious lost city, and he kind of makes some enemies along the way as well. This kind of barons in this other sort of land. So this film is quite a cheesy movie, I have to say. One of the I have to mention this. The first thing, one of the kind of the worst thing about this film is the music. The music is so bad, and kind of this really 80s kind of synth music that really doesn't go along with the actual sort of feel of the film, and it's the same music pretty much plays the whole way through the film. It's so annoying. It really does take you out of it, because all you do is kind of listen to this music when it plays. Now, I'm not certainly saying that this film is an amazing piece of art. It is really cheesy. It actually very reminds me of, if you've ever seen the Monty Python's Holy Grail, it kind of reminds me of that, but without the kind of comedy element to it. So if you can imagine that if they just stripped out the comedy from the Holy Grail movie, and you pretty much just had it as a straight movie, it kind of reminds me of that. It almost looks like a very sort of Terry Gilliam type movie. I have to say, I mean, Sean Connery, when he's on screen, he's very good. And Sean Connery's obviously a legend in that. He's not in the film all that much. I believe he actually filmed his kind of relatively limited scenes in between filming one of his James Bond movies. And when he's on screen, obviously, the screen really sizzles. But you've also got Peter Cushing in a kind of a limited role. Miles O'Keeffe has never been a particularly fantastic actor. And I think his lines were overdubbed because, this is an earlier role, and the accent that you hear him speak is a very kind of posh English accent. So I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure his lines are overdubbed. I mean, it's dubbed relatively well, to be fair. And I believe the Princess Lynette was also dubbed because she's actually a French actress, and this was her first English-speaking role. And again, the English sort of accent is very English, if you see what I mean. So I have a feeling probably her lines were dubbed as well, probably along with a few other actors, because I know some of this movie was filmed in France. So, but it's a kind of a strange film in a way, because it doesn't follow maybe a traditional narrative, so to speak. We set at the beginning of the movie this quest, and then it kind of goes off and does it kind of almost some separate stories. And then it kind of sort of ties up the end. So it doesn't really follow necessarily what you would expect to be a traditional narrative, and that kind of makes it interesting to a certain degree. Although I do find it does meander a little bit here and there. Now, I'd say it is a very cheesy movie. The whole kind of, pretty much everything you'll see on screen, especially towards the sort of where these in the castles and the kind of like the bumbling guards and things like that. It's very, very cheesy. Looks very comical. Like I said, this really does remind me of the kind of Holy Grail type sort of thing, type sort of movies that you're going to see there. However, I will say this: when you have some action scenes, when there's actually a proper sort of fight scene between sort of two knights, the costumes look fantastic, and they're very kind of Excalibur and sort of shiny armor, very sort of detailed, fantastical armor and stuff like that. Looks really good, and there's some okay battle scenes on the actual open ground. I got a feeling the actual action scenes was shot by a different director, from what I understand, and it kind of notices because the rest of the film has a different look to it compared to when you see more of the sort of classical action scenes. It's certainly not one of the more classic sort of 80s fantasy movies. I have to say this is probably going to fall slightly below average. However, it is still a relatively interesting film to watch. Pretty first and foremost, because obviously you've got Sean Connery in it. But as I said, it's an interesting movie if you kind of like your sort of Arthurian legends. I quite like the subject of this because it takes place in the time of King Arthur, but it really isn't based on his legend ultimately. And I always think that in the King Arthur movies and sort of books and stuff that we see like that, we've probably seen, and there's a long period of time within the King Arthur legend where there's actually a peacetime, and it's always going to skip over in all the sort of the sort of movie adaptations that we've seen. So I quite like a movie that's got, that it actually takes place and actually isn't much to do with the actual King Arthur story himself. So it makes Gawain one of the more fleshed out knights within King Arthur's court. So I'm going to give this movie a 4 out of 10. So it is below average, but I still say it has got some redeeming qualities. What are your thoughts on it? Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.